Welcome to a brief presentation for my audio recording of Vietnam history 1945 to 1955 before the Vietnam War. I won't completely follow what's going on with the screen parts, but this is brief. It's preferred if it's paused and read. I'll be taking what's taken on the screen and limiting it. I do have a little paper and a paper telling me some things I should mention from not the that's not on the screen. But again, it's preferred if it's read and paused. This is like note taking, those sort of things. It's actual learning, and in a way that presents the war in a non-Western propaganda-ish way. That's the whole entire goal of the presentation, is to present it from a socialist lens that's factual, uh, but not completely excusing everything the socialists did. Again, I'm a scientific socialist, not a utopian, takes everything that one does greatly. There you go, what I'm saying. I am doing this very late, so let's just start. So this presentation that was given was presented in a way that questions were related. It's not something that you guys need. The presentation goes from 1945 onward to 1955 in a chronological order. To when the Vietnam War starts. The presentation covers foreign nations to understand the Vietnam events and foreign thoughts. This presentation is meant to be beginner friendly, which it is. Remember, there's going to be a few images throughout the presentation that helps you. So, let's begin. What will be covered? The French, United States, USSR, German Democratic Republic, People's Republic of China, etc. This is to understand Vietnam's relations to the foreign outside world. Because without it, you won't exactly what's going to understand what's happening inside of Vietnam without understanding the events abroad. Yet, in this presentation, there isn't really much outside information to look at that isn't really factual and government focused. The citizens really didn't understand what much was going on because at this time, for most of the presentation, what was going on inside of Vietnam was the problems that Vietnam was focusing on. On themselves, so the French primarily. So we're gonna have basic colonial history. Who were the Viet Minh? Who was Ho Chi Minh, and a few other people and organizations. We have a little bit of the beginning of the anti-war movement, the Diem regime in South Vietnam, the 1954 Geneva Convention. So, the world in 1945. The Great Patriotic War / World War II was at an end. The German Reich was crushed by the Allied forces. And France was recovering from occupation, which would have been the occupier of Vietnam at the time. And a lot of people in Western Europe said, all right, things are going to go back to normal. We'll be able to take South Africa back. We're going to be able to take Indochina. We're going to be back on the top of the world in no time. So the United States, on the other hand, was out of the Great Depression. They didn't have any casualties in World War II. Yeah, they got Pearl Harbor bombed and a few other things. But in general, out of everybody in Europe, they came out as the world superpower. The USSR was sort of torn down. They were recovering. yeah, the United States gained a lot of benefit in World War II. They were able to sell weapons, make cash, and take out countries. Now all these countries are under their influence, and they were the leader in general. Instead, the USSR had to focus on rebuilding Eastern Europe also, so they had way more to do than just recover themselves. They had to build up a whole entire massive chunk of the continent. And Vietnam was just out of Japanese rule. So yeah, Japanese was bombed and tired of war in general. So let's understand the Vietnamese situation. Before the Second World War, they were under French control, and and when the French went to Nazi occupation, the Japanese took over Vietnam. Uh, Before the Vietnam War, before the war, Vietnam's history has been a history of constant struggle. They had to deal with the Chinese, who took a lot of chunk of their land. They had to be under the occupation of the French. They had to be under the occupation of the Japanese. There was a constant history of being abused by foreign nations and struggling to keep like a form of independence. Uh, so yes, it's the Vietnam situation wasn't exactly good. Their whole entire country was just basically a constant abuse for foreign nations to gain materials from them. So after 1945, there was a sort of sense of hope to build the country anew. So why were the French not exactly respected by the Vietnamese? Well, a lot of the people at the time was said we brought the people of Indochina things they never thought imaginable. We built factories, we built industry, we built up the country, we built up trade, we built up classes. Well, when you look at it in those terms, yes, they did good. They went in there and slaughtered a bunch of citizens to do good, but it isn't generally appreciated when you storm into a country without their permission and take them over. And plus, you can say they built up wealth, but a lot of the sources I linked, even a United States source and French source, say the French abused the Vietnamese. They were working days and days with like the 14-hour workday to produce commodities that people abroad took. They didn't have to. They didn't even take advantage of the commodities that they built. So, and the Vietnamese who left, they were still starving. They barely even had shelter to live in. So yeah, they built up factories and all that, but they weren't getting any benefit from the factories they were building. It was all going abroad. They got none of the wealth from the trade. They had nothing. They were living in shacks. Barely even making food to survive. So, yes, they went in there and built stuff up, but it never went to them. It went to the rich business owners in France that had factories in Indochina. So, no, it wasn't exactly the best. The French were in Indochina, so the wealth went back to the French in France, but not even the citizens of France really got much benefit. They had to pay heavy prices for it, so in the end, it just went to a very rich few, and it was understandable for why they disliked the French in general. So the Japanese went to Vietnam after they were taken over by the Nazis. The Nazis were like, you can have Indochina. We're not really much interested into it. And so they went in there. They seen that the French government was still in decent control of the people who were there. So they said and set a deal. You guys can continue what you're doing, but we're just going to like take the resources for a war conquest. You're gonna give us food. You're gonna give us the resources, and those sort of things. And this just went to battling the United States, the United Soviet Socialist Republic, and republics and other forces. So it wasn't really much of a much different. Let's say that it just went to different people on the top, and they were still starving. In a way, the Vietnamese had a different feeling towards Japan, considering it was another an Asian superpower, and they were shocked that they were able to take out the Viet, the French. So it's quite an interesting thing for them. So Japan got removed in the early months of 1945. So they were weakening as a world power, and the French, and they realized that they were getting weak, so they attempted to stage a coup in Vietnam to get back control. This actually failed, and a bunch of the people in the French administration were killed, and the office officials were murdered. And Japan said, uh, the Vietnamese should have a right to own Vietnam. So when they killed all the French for this coup, they sort of just let Vietnam rule Vietnam, which was an absolute shock. It would have been the obvious decision. They realized that they were weakening as a world power. They didn't want the French to have control. And a few weeks after they let they decided to declare their war and domination conquest was over. So this left the French out of the equation, and the Japanese were gone. The Vietnamese people felt that the Allies would actually side on them and let them have independence for the first time. So this is a major thing for them. Yeah, with the help of Japan, which wasn't really much the good guys, they felt that they had freedom. Yet the Japanese had the emperor, sort of like as the leader when they left. So who were the Viet Minh? These people would become like the big figure. They were actually called the League for the Independence of Vietnam, the Viet Minh. They were founded in early 1941. They actually led sort of the Vietnamese fight against the Japanese in World War II. They were funded by the United States for. They'd given full about the Japanese to the U.S. and the U.S. to give them weapons and food and those sort of things to help combat the Japanese. They were primarily a communist organization, but they had like other ideologies of people, just nationalistic conservatives, liberal types, all those. They were in the organization, so liberation of Vietnam was the first goal, and sort of the communist goal was the second goal. In general, they were very trusted among people. Ho Chi Minh was the leader of the Viet Minh. His history is a bit vague, but it's a interesting one. So he was born in Vietnam. He was known for being a skinny, acknowledgeable type guy to most people, and that was primarily in the United States. He was actually born in an upper class family. He gained recognition for being a sort of Vietnamese nationalist and communist over time quite quickly. This was even in his 20s. He is actually quite a target of the French once this is figured out, because nationalistic type people in nations dominated by a foreign country doesn't really go well, and they normally tend to rebel. He went to he went to France to study, and he started working with communist parties there. When the Russian Revolution came, he sort of went over to Russia. They told him to keep focused on Vietnam, and it would actually be quite a decent place for revolutionary activity. And after that, a lot of his information is unknown. They speculate he was in China, Russia, yeah, Lenin, Stalin, Mao, and not really much was known about him. Yet it was realized he was sort of primarily in Vietnam, with the Viet Minh. He he had a lot of recognition with people in Vietnam as sort of like a revolutionary figure. He was quite respected, even though I was like name was unknown. This made him quite a big figure in Vietnam, even when it wasn't that big. He actually was a studier of Confucianism in a lot of his younger years. So let's look at the August Revolution. This was now we're in like the actual 1945 stuff and onward. So we're now out of that like pre-stage, like even pre-Viet Minh stage. Now let's look at this. So after 1945, not 1945, after the Japanese left, he declared Vietnam's independence, and he actually based it off the United States independence from Britain, Articles of Independence, Declaration of Independence from Britain, and he. This is a line from his famous speech in the August Revolution. Can you hear me, patriots? Dear patriots. Yes, we can, said the masses. So the Democratic Republic of Vietnam was declared. So they actually got the emperor himself to resign. Resign from Vietnamese rule, which he would later become the leader of the state of Vietnam for the French. He was a heavy, staunch anti-communist. Yet after like after the communist won, he sort of toned that down. And I think he moved to the United States. So yes, they were declaring democracy, yet they were still leaning towards the United States. But if the French were to get involved, they'd actually change their mind, which they did. The United States knew that the USSR wasn't in any power. China it was like in a civil war. They said, you know what, since we're the world power, they aren't much worry. We won't have to worry about them very often. So this was what the August Revolution was. The independence, freedom, everything that the Vietnamese wanted seemed to be coming to a reality. So that didn't last very long. The French were already being rearmed in 1945. Not even late 1945. So, the Allies were responsible for heading to Vietnam and disarming the Japanese. And when they said disarming the Japanese, they might have meant actually de-arming the Japanese and rearming the French. So Britain was in charge of de-arming South Vietnam. China was in charge of de-arming northern Vietnam, and so they began disarming the Japanese. And the arms weren't going to the Vietnamese people, they were heading to the French. So this actually, in a way, was going against the Allied orders to keep peace and disarm, because they were actually making unrest. So the French were being rearmed. The British officials didn't have any problem with it. They said that the French had rightful claim to Vietnam, in a way, which in truth made very little sense. Yet they were still an imperialist power with Africa. So what was really expected? Were they really gonna turn their backs to that ideologues type scheme, or were they actually going to be friendly and arm natives of the country? Well, they weren't going to do that. They were actually just going to rearm the French. Yet they began taking key points on the 22nd of September 1945 with a night attack. So the French took over quite quick because the Vietnamese didn't have the guns. The French did. And as stated before all this rule and chaos, the Japanese left without really giving them much. The Japanese left with all the guns and things, and they remained with the guns. And the Vietnamese had no guns, they had no weapons, so they can't really do much. Shortly after the French secret takeover, they had an outburst of pleasure, and they began to make it very clear that their takeover happened. And they began like shooting and terrorizing Vietnamese citizens, which made them feel weak and very furious. So a lot of the Vietnamese citizens weren't very happy about this. To be honest, I guess remembering working at 14 hours a day with very little food and money, it doesn't really bring back happy memories, does it? So, they just sort of already began to struggle, considering that they already thought they were free, yet they had actually only begun to struggle for freedom again. So, the French began to fight against the Vietnamese, and in 1946 had major losses. The reason this really happened was because they were very arrogant about it. They put little focus in it. They thought the Vietnamese were inferior and they could easily take them out with their guns. Yet that didn't really work, truth be told. So Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh faced a lot of problems with the Chinese nationalists in northern Vietnam. So the Chinese were sort of like doing similar things, except they were actually raping and plundering the land themselves instead of disarming people. So he had to go to France to seek a resolution to them being rearmed and taking back control. Oops. Here. So they had the Ho Chi Minh went to France to seek a deal. He didn't want much violence. He actually wanted to solve things peacefully. Yet when he went there, he already had a suspicion of betrayal and distrust. Because the French really haven't had a history of being a very trustworthy people and very friendly. The French actually had a so-called communist government. Yet these people really, they were sort of like what you call a social chauvinist. They put their nation above other nations. So when it comes to internationalism, it's very vague for them. They don't really have any interest in developing other nations. They're sort of like a false communist. They're sort of like pro-imperialist, and yet that sort of means they aren't very communist, does it? So, in so the agreement that was really being sought was a northern Vietnam, southern Vietnam type thing. In the end, which really wouldn't have even come to an agreement for another few years. Uh, Also, when he went to France, he immediately saw that they would declare that everything's going well in public, yet things weren't really going very well when they were actually doing the talks. And the cabinet was very empty. At first, they didn't have any government really in place. It was early 1946. They got out of Nazi occupation. They were still rebuilding the government, so they didn't really have much time to focus on what was going on inside Vietnam. They were more focused on what was going on with them. So let's do a quick look on why the Viet Minh were actually respected by the people. So they were known as a Vietnamese independent militia to most of the public instead of a communist organization, because their main focus was the liberation of Vietnam, not exactly the communist part. Yet most independence movements in the Third World during the 20th century were communist organizations, yet the communist name wasn't really that was affiliated with it. So it was the independence movement was actually quite a massive one for Vietnam. So the Viet Minh, even before World War II, they had like predecessors that were just as big, and they were sort of like the reformation of those things. We can say most of them were destroyed by the murdering and killing of the independence movements and the organizations. They they obviously had good intentions, and this actually grew respect and cooperation with the Viet Minh from the people. They were honest to the people, so that's the thing that was really big about the Viet Minh compared to France and the United States. When the United States and France entered Vietnam, their intentions were very clear. It was not good intentions, yet the Viet Minh intentions were also very clear. It was very obvious it was good intentions. And they actually helped people. When they entered a city, like when you hear about the Shining Path, they were known for the Shining Path was like a false communist organization in Peru, and they were very violent. They declared themselves a communist group, yet the leader had a god complex, and he didn't follow Mao Zedong's ideas of the mass line. When his group went to a city, they'd restrict everything. He had no freedom. He had none of that. It's sort of like the if you think of the stereotype of the conservative concept of a communist organization, that's what it was. This is the complete opposite of the conservative stereotype of communist organization. Same, the Viet Minh are like the Bolsheviks, they're like the PRC, People's Liberation Army, all that. They did the same exact thing. They'd enter a city, they talk to people, know about the concerns, help them with the concerns. The same idea with the mass line. You listen to the masses, take after them, follow what they want, and get what they want done. Dictatorship of the proletariat type stuff. That's clearly what they did. Being honest and following the interest of the masses is exactly what a communist organization should do, and that's what they did. Sorry for the sidetrack stuff. You guys probably have no idea what I was talking about. So they had to try one last try for peace. It was 1946. He went to Paris. Communists were in government, but they didn't have very much interest in Ho Chi Minh. The people in the government absolutely did not appreciate Ho Chi Minh. He gave a speech in Paris asking for the patriotism and unity in Vietnam and how it's needed. And it didn't go well. The people who were there had no interest in it. So he left Paris soon after, and he said he would return for negotiations soon, but it never happened. The March Agreement had crumbled. So the French government decided that violence was needed in France to keep control. So what did they do? They actually went in there, beat, murdered, and raped, and tortured rebelling Vietnamese. So they just got on their ships, headed to Vietnam, and this is what they called teaching a lesson to inferior to an inferior race. And this is exactly what happened. They actually went in there, beaten, murdered, and raped. And again, what we spoke about on the last slide, it's very obvious why the Viet Minh were chosen over the French to the masses. They weren't there for good intentions. They were there because they're a capitalist economy, their interests go to the top, and the rich people and corporations that were there before the Nazis needed Vietnam. That's where a lot of their money flow came from. Commodities were very rich in Vietnam. and they didn't want the Vietnamese citizens to be the people in charge of it, which the Vietnamese sort of like, as some people in Vietnam would say, their culture is very socialist, so that's why it's very easy for them to get engaged in socialist ideology. And they sort of knew that. So by the end of 1946, so the first Indochina War had begun. This is the war with France and the Vietnamese citizens slash Viet Minh in Vietnam. So, okay, Ho Chi Minh and Viet Minh were actually forced out of Hanoi. The French didn't just target the South, they were targeting all of Vietnam. They were spread out, and they were winning. They wanted total domination in Vietnam. They wanted the Vietnamese citizens back in the factories and working for them. And the Vietnamese citizens had a glimpse of what freedom looked like, and they wanted it. A lot of people began working with the Viet Minh. And the French were actually quite confident they'd wipe out the Vietnamese rebellions, specifically the Viet Minh, in a few weeks, because they had superior weapons, also with U.S. aid. The USA was very interested in aiding them. But the Viet Minh had the support of the masses. That's something that's held it in. Why were the French failing? Well, Vietnamese citizens were educated. They knew what freedom looked like. They'd raid French vehicles and give intel. They worked in with the French as spies. They give intel to the Viet Minh. Bad treatment. Again, they heard of the Viet Minh. Oh, I got bad treatment. Well, I heard of these people. Should I go join them, support them? Yes, I should. So the French intel that was gathered by these people would immediately go to the Viet Minh. The arrogance of the French sort of was their downfall. If they were less arrogant, they might have actually been able to overpower them with the weapons that they had, but they were, again, extremely arrogant and full of themselves, and they thought they'd wipe them out in an instant. So, the French the French resistance. There actually is French resistance, because they're so like the people trying to take them over. Now, okay. Oh, God. Yeah, sorry about that. I can't really pause stuff, so when I get confused, I can't really do much. So, examples, I think example stories of people fighting against the French aren't hard to find, actually. Like, hundreds of thousands of people would become spies, soldiers, writers, etc., even scientists, against the French. To fight imperialist conquerors, who viewed them as objects for work and factory cheap labor, and that's precisely what they are there for, and the Vietnamese people knew it. So, a woman working. Okay, I'm gonna read this for word because it's precise and I can't really read it for my own words here. For example, there was a woman working on the farms whom would go to a fellow Vietnamese desk worker and ask for money, and they would exchange and secretly give intel of the French. If they were caught, they would have been shot, dead, and buried. Then the woman would take the intel to the Viet Minh, which would be examined and used. Those who could not offer all would make music or write stories for people. Some people would give food to the soldiers and other things that would help out, but it's all because the Viet Minh had the support of the masses, and the French did not have that at all. So the story summarizes that people were willing to risk their lives to remove the French, and this isn't an uncommon story. Many other people would do this against the French. They were just that bad of rulers, and it wasn't that long ago when they were in charge. Even just in 1939, that was 6 years ago. People remember that. When you treat people so bad to a point where anybody can just come in and take power, yeah, that's exactly what happens. Yet this time they actually had efficient, educated, militant people who were working in their interests, so it was just even that worse. And again, this right here. I wrote this in my own words, but this comes from a USA documentary that was made by a corporation. This isn't information that is like hard to find, rare. It was back in a time when businesses were more like, let's just say they had to make these concessions. It was like during the Vietnam War, anti-war protests, so some people, I mean businesses, were more willing to like give up Vietnam. They didn't have much reason to be there. Okay, guns as an organization. Let's see what the military strategy of Vietnam was in the late 1940s. Okay. So Ho Chi Minh told a female leader they had women in powerful positions in the Viet Minh because they valued women's rights, unlike some countries. Uh, our allies can only give so much food, guns, and tools. Our primary resource is stealing the French of those tools. So, what's being made out of this? We can precisely tell that he's saying we don't have much guns, not many people are going to give it to us. What we need to do is do like guerrilla warfare style. We need to get in there and rob the French of their tools. Use the guns we have and raid. And this actually worked. They were able to get way more guns than they had quickly. Use the guns you have to get other guns. That's precisely what was being said. We can't rely on others. We need to be self-sufficient here. So therefore, the spying information on French resources that they gained was being used to the advantage. They used everything they had. If you had to eat some older food, you gotta do it. So train stops, for example, were extraordinarily useful in the cause. So the French had trains, ships, all those sort of things that they just use information on and raid it and take it. And they didn't have much defense there, shockingly. The French did not. So much ammo wasn't really wasted. So they'd use guns, they'd have to get more guns. That's what's being said. Nothing at all would go to waste. Just an example on what the French would do. The French would declare an area pacified just to find it invaded by the Vietnamese and taken away from them because of rebellions more times than not. Okay, hold on. All right, we're getting closer to the end. Okay, so the French decided it was actually time to make a government. Instead of just raiding and murdering people, the French actually decided to make a government of their own, which would be called the State of Vietnam. So when you're losing a war, it's easy to come up to the conclusion that you need to make your country seem like the good guy. That's exactly what they did. They chose Bao Dai, the last emperor of Vietnam, who's under control. I mean, it was in power during the French rule days in the 1880s through the 1930s. So it just didn't work very well. They knew, I mean, the Vietnamese quickly realized that this wasn't actually a regime following their interest. It was just them trying to get back to the good old days of abusing the Vietnamese, the Vietnam land. Uh, it was just called the State of Vietnam. It was still, I mean, they tried to make it appear independent. Yeah, it was just a French control zone with a sort of fake government. It was sort of like also a foundation for a support base. Made it easier to run things than the actual government instead of it just being a bunch of military invasions and guns to people's heads. So now we're in the year 1950. Things start to speed up here quite quickly. So in the year 1950, the People's Republic of China would send their help, their people, during the Chinese Civil War. The People's Republic of China sent their military generals to help them out, though they had also the Korean War area to also worry about. Things were stable enough in China that they sent resources to help the Viet Minh. So they were also the first nation to represent Ho Chi Minh's government. The United Soviet Socialist Republics quickly followed after China. And the Soviet Socialist Republics, again, they were more focused on rebuilding their own nation. They had a lot of good socialist leaders, that sort of like representatives and all that. They were quickly killed in the Great Patriotic War, so they couldn't really do much. But they sent all the help they could, representing the Viet Minh government. The United States represented Val Dai's French Vietnam. It was expected. I mean, they had interest in staying on good terms with the French, and they were taking out a communist government, and the French knew that the United States sure the heck wasn't gonna destroy that opportunity to remove another socialist rebellion off the face of the earth. So Vietnam became a hotspot for the Cold War quite quickly, even though it wasn't really as big as the Korean War at the time. So by the end of 1950, the United States sent $150 million USD, and that's into terms in the 1950s. That's probably like $900 million or something. Not sure, but it's sure the heck way more massive than it is today. That's still massive today. The French for Vietnam, they called the what was happening in Vietnam imperialistic communism, which isn't exactly true. The USA and the French were actually the imperialists. There's no such thing as imperialistic communism. It's a fake term made by Harry Truman, who began the Korean War. Hey, let's move on. So warfare methods changed quite quick. So with like the United States, USSR, PRC all getting engaged, they all solidified their positions in the war. It was very obvious that tensions were rising as world superpowers placed their positions in this region. In Vietnam by the end of 1950, they're sending all the resources they can to help out with China and the USSR, and they were able to build trade networks in Vietnam, which would be of great help to to aid them, which gave them guns and other things that helped out quite quick. And this ended the guerrilla warfare style in North Vietnam, that they were actually now able to use like real combat methods, considering they had way more guns and superpowers now, and with all the also raiding they did at the French crates and guns. So the French came to very serious blows, and they had to switch out commanders. This is a bad sign for the French. Now we're to 1951. With all the changes in war methods and all that, it's very clear that things were changing quite quick. The Vietnamese Communist Party changed their name to the Vietnamese Workers' Party. It was just a more generic type name. Not generic. What am I saying there? Sorry. It was a better name for the conditions which was they were in. Just being more representative of the masses. So by 1951, Ho Chi Minh sort of like had a massive figurehead in the world. He was backed by the USSR and the PRC. The French Vietnam decided to try to gain more credibility by creating a national army for South Vietnam, which in general also helped them in the way that they were able now to actually get Vietnamese soldiers in. Like those easily manipulated and those sort of things, richer people, when they were able to sign up for the army now and become war commanders, those sort of things. So the United States was wanting at this time was wanting the French to give more independence to Vietnam. If you get what I mean by that, like elections and those sort of things. But the French refused to give up even the slightest bit of power, knowing that they would not stop funding their anti-communist war at all. So they were able to keep power. The French excused the war in defense of Western civilization and national honor. So at this time, the anti-war movement was beginning. This one's just gonna keep short. They were so the Vietnam at this time wasn't exactly the precise anti-war movement part. There was a few protests in France as they seemed to go down a little bit. But in general, it was more focused towards Korea. And there were anti-war protests in Vietnam also. So there was minor protests in cities across France and the United States. The French were getting nervous by the end of 1952 as they continued to make massive losses against the Viet Minh, but they continued to do their warpath anyways. One thing that was beneficial to the French is they did not draft soldiers. Instead, the soldiers were optional. The soldiers were on low morale all throughout. This was sort of like the beginning of anti-war figurehead, socialist, Black Panther Party type figures rising to power in the 1950s. So major events were going to kick off till the 1960s when the United States was draft soldiers into war, and socialist party leaders and parties / leaders would address the war to the masses. So Korea was the beginning of the anti-war movement. That's what we're getting out of this. So let's look at a quick look at the United States. We have people such as Eisenhower, who said he would end the Korean War with a crushing communist defeat. He was elected in 1952. He was a staunch anti-communist. He was a war veteran from World War II. He was sort of like figurehead that was really popular among Christians and Southern people in the United States, but intelligent. His administration had Richard Nixon as the vice president, who would be a representative to Indochina. The administration stated their goal was to dominate Southeast Asia to remove the communist menace by any means possible. Very anti-communist and a very big figure for the beginnings of the Vietnam War. He was the leader from 1953 to 1961, but a lot of his speeches and everything began in 1952 when he was in the election campaign and won by a decent landslide. In 1953, Nixon would be sent to Vietnam to support the French against the Viet Minh. He and his administration told the French they would have much more weapons for the battle against the Viet Minh. He told them that compromises with the communists would be massively unacceptable. Sort of like generic anti-communist information. It's just not many people in the United States paid attention, but they liked the idea that their government was taking war to the communists, which the 1950s was sort of like the peak of the Cold War. But I mean, the early 1960s would also be quite big for the Vietnam War and anti-war protest. So let's take a quick look at the impacts from the Korean War. What would happen? What would be the massive events that would kick off a lot of things? Well, let's take a look at the impacts. The Korean War had a major impact on the United States for their actions in Vietnam in general. So a lot of the methods that were used by the United States in the Korean War would be transferred to the Vietnam War, like the ruthless murder of citizens, interrogations, general no compromises, the overall excuses for the wars, all that sort of thing would be massively used. The United States is no stranger to war. They had the Manifest Destiny, which was the murder of massive amounts of natives and conquering of land in the United States. They also had the Philippines. They had a little thing in Cuba where they had a dictator in place. So but the Korean War was the first large-scale war against communism abroad for the United States. That gained media traction, news from other countries. That's basically what that means by the large-scale part. That's really it in short. It was also the beginning of the Red Scare for the 1950s. The war was marked by extreme violence, started many practices in the United States and for abroad. That's really about it. So and now we're at one of the beginning of one of the most large-scale battles in the Vietnam War. The Viet Minh would use Dien Bien Phu as an attack spot, specifically against Laos. So that's what they had it for. The French thought it would be a good idea to launch an engagement. They did. In November of 1953, they deployed troops. The French command thought, after they took it over, that an attack would be very unlikely, considering that they blocked supply chains and supposedly everything was broken, no transport, so they had very weak defense, thinking that an attack was almost impossible. The Viet Minh actually looked at Dien Bien Phu as a good place to attack, but were very cautious about it. They were expecting that there was going to be lots of troops. It was very obvious that it was going to be a difficult place to get to. It's going to require a lot more morale of soldiers, transportation help, and all that sort of stuff. Uh, so, uh, they were very cautious on knowing that they lost battles against the French in their strong points before, but they decided to attack. That's exactly what I was saying. Events leading to the battle. So, the Viet Minh brought 50,000 soldiers with guns, 4 times the number of French troops there. We're gonna speed through this stuff. This stuff's probably easy to read on your own. The Soviets, East Germans, Chinese brought trucks with guns and material through roads built by Vietnamese workers. The Chinese advisors were there to help out. It was for strategy reasons, sort of like giving advice. Here's how many soldiers you bring, guns, crates, vehicles. So they had help from all these nations to transfer things. They walked miles upon miles to get here. They made it through with the help of traits, carrying food. A commander from the Viet Minh stated after the war, each and every soldier in the Viet Minh had more morale than the French. They came here to oppress us, and we are going to take our land back. So again, this goes back to what I was saying. They had to support the masses. The French were clearly had no support from almost any Vietnamese person. So the plan was to wipe out the French camp with a massive human wave assault quickly. That's sort of the Viet Minh commander in charge of this was Giap. My pronunciation of Vietnamese names are quite bad, so please don't take that too harshly. So this was actually the first massive battle. It actually become a massive symbolic thing for the the beginning of the Vietnam War and the war for the independence of Vietnam. The Dien Bien Phu attack was on January 13, 1954. The battle began with the methods of the Chinese advisors insisted on the massive human wave assaults. The Viet Minh were also very well camouflaged, so the planes above from the French couldn't really see them. It was sort of like a secretive thing. So the planes were sort of rendered useless as the camouflaged soldiers. They were shooting from tunnels. Shoot, I'm forgetting the name. Trenches. So the Dien Bien Phu is one of the most iconic battles. By the end of the first day, on the Battle of Dien Bien Phu from the Viet Minh, they destroyed the first airstrip. On the second night, the French artillery commander committed suicide, and the French command became unresponsive as the battle had a winning status for the Viet Minh. The third day, Vietnamese command pulled back and focused on rebuilding morale. The Vietnamese were way better at rebuilding morale than the French in general. So as soon as the Vietnamese pulled back in the trenches, they were so far in, they rendered the airstrip completely useless anymore. So they began building, and they rebuilt morale, talked to each other, healed the injuries of the people, motivating the soldiers, all sorts of things, that stuff. The Viet Minh were able now to set up long-term plans for Dien Bien Phu. They had Dien Bien Phu in their hands. They were pushed back, running out of medical. Okay, so for the French, this battle was a complete disaster. Their own medical supplies, rain was destroying the remaining resources. Clean water is almost nowhere. The planes weren't able to evacuate the wounded to the Viet Minh being there. So things were absolutely terrible for them. For the first time, the French requested urgently the United States to intervene. They temporarily refused on this offer. So, after that, the Geneva Conference was in the midst of beginning. This was on April 26th, 1954. So, what were they focusing on there? Well, the primary focuses were on the Korean War, which isn't the topic here, though. It can be stated that it was not that big of a deal there. There was just little final wraps. And they also had things going on about the First Indochina War. Vietnam was separated into two states. Northern Vietnam, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, and South Vietnam, state of Vietnam. They were supposed to. So they were told that elections in 1956 were going to take place to unify the country, which didn't really work out in the end. A few days before, the officials talks about Indochina, the Indian Phu, was in Viet Minh hands on May 7th, 1954. The United States and its allies were very displeased with the Geneva Conference, knowing that so far France was probably going to lose the elections because they had almost no support. The United States was not interested in elections because communists were going to win. Throughout the Geneva Conference, they were also told to remain silent and just listen. That's what the U.S. officials were primarily told. After 6 weeks of conversation, the conference came down to very little conclusion about the situation. So, this is where things start to wrap up. With almost nothing being resolved, the French cabinet was an absolute mayhem. When the French cabinet resigned, they put in a supposed anti-war prime minister, Pierre Mendès, who was put in place, claiming if the war isn't resolved in 30 days, he'll resign. The United States was also very terrified that the French were going to give out on Indochina, which would sort of remain them to be the last with British help. So the France and its prime minister came to an agreement 1 week before the deadline. So the elections were going to take place 2 years after. The Viet Minh would get less than half of Vietnam for the temporary demarcation line. So the Soviets and Chinese actually forced the Viet Minh to accept this and compromise. The elections were halted, hoping that the Viet Minh victory polling would soon fall. The United States was displeased still, knowing that the Viet Minh were still on the path to victory. And the communists felt annoyed with the continued halts and unification of elections. Fall of 1954. So the Viet Minh actually went back to the city of Hanoi. They now had control of Hanoi. The Viet Minh were also still confident in the elections for 1956, even though they still were displeased with the long-term wait and still feeling robbed that they didn't even get half of the territory. The French actually left Vietnam in the end. They took back their housing, factory, and dead, just taking back everything they could to destroy the nation of Vietnam in the end. Yet they had the United States in panic and wanting to guarantee that the Viet Minh would collapse. Too many Vietnamese are actually thankful to Viet Minh for removing the French, so this gave more political power to the Viet Minh in the end. and the French also still had major control over the South Vietnam politicians. They were still in the background, helping them out. So the Geneva Convention also placed Diem, a mild nationalist Vietnamese leader, in charge of South Vietnam. He was also a hardcore theocrat who was a hardcore Catholicist. Uh, he he was also very worried that the Viet Minh would take over, so he was more focused on. Yeah, so let's just do this now. In South Vietnam in the fall of 1954, they weren't worried about governing. They were more worried about how they were going to leave Vietnam when the Viet Minh take over. Because they knew that most likely the Viet Minh were going to win. They had the support. They were going to win the elections. So they got, since he was a Catholic leader, he got many Catholics to leave Vietnam. Leave North Vietnam, I meant. Believing that their religious views would be more accepted in South Vietnam, which in the end it really was, because they became a straight up theocracy. So Catholicism was the only religion that you're allowed to follow. The United States also began training soldiers in South Vietnam, and urged a lot of Vietnamese to leave Vietnam before communism took hold. So South Vietnam had a lot of armed theocrats to take power, and armed gangsters of opium trade trying to gain political power. The South Vietnam was in heavy turmoil. So they had a lot of rebellions. Just like the war of drug lords from France, all those sort of things. And if this wasn't solved, the United States was going to remove funding from South Vietnam. So this had Premier Diem urged to consolidate power before U.S. funding left. So the opium dealer tried to come to an agreement, but Diem refused because it blocked. He was a hardcore Catholicist, and he was very anti-drugs. So they went to war. In the end, he won, but the capital city of South Vietnam, Saigon, was in absolute ruins, and many innocents were killed out in the streets. So yeah, industry factions were warring, yet Diem's consolidated power and the U.S. funding resumed, yet many homeless people were in the streets, and starvation was quite common in South Vietnam. Diem also became very distrustful and stubborn. This set off a path of leadership that would destabilize the nation. In northern Vietnam, on the other hand, it was quite stable. People were farming. They were waiting until the elections in 1956, which wouldn't happen. They were advertising and pushing to win. The people of North Vietnam would receive updates from the people in the south and create widespread support for Ho Chi Minh. The people in northern Vietnam would study, farm, be politically active, engage, all that sort of things. The USSR would continue to send aid to Vietnam and let people study in Soviet universities, and so China would do the same. So as we end off, the elections did not happen in 1956. The United States and Diem realized a landslide victory for Ho Chi Minh, the Viet Minh government. Vietnam remained a divided nation. The United States called Premier Diem a hero for Vietnam, an example of freedom and anti-communism. Diem's police and secret service would find communists, socialists, or any form of anti-Diem or United States people and activists, have them shot, killed, or jailed. Repression was extreme, and Diem's anger was inhumane and cruel. People were forced to accept Catholicism as their primary religion and had no choice but to denounce the communists. This led to a war for national liberation against Diem and the United States. The Vietnam War had begun. Here's all these sources. Sorry for this, me starting to read off the screen. I just wanted to get through this as quick as possible. hope this audio recording was useful for those who wanted to take advantage of it. That's really about it. And I'm hoping you all can read and take use of my next second and third presentations of Vietnam and the Vietnam War.